I had only been back to visit. And I got into Buddhism in Japan, into Zen practice. I lived there for a year, and then I went to Thailand, and then I became a Theravada monk for a while too. And then ever since then, I've been practicing Buddhism. And up until Michael suggested it, it never occurred to me that maybe I should go to Ireland, go back indeed to my hometown, Belfast, and bring some practice there. When I was growing up in Belfast, it was under quite harsh conditions. Like I remember when I was about 10 going to England and seeing signs outside of pubs that would say, no Irish or dogs allowed. You know? Like when I was growing up, when we went to London, we went to the Irish Quarter, because that would really be the only place where you would be allowed to stay. And then in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, through now would be like a 330-year history, this division between Catholic and Protestant. And so I grew up Catholic, which was a minority, and not surprisingly, the underprivileged minority, and the oppressed minority. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a kind of a rebellion against the English occupation of Ireland, and it resulted in a peace treaty where Southern Ireland became independent and Northern Ireland stayed part of Great Britain. And that was because the Protestant majority were identified strongly with being part of Britain, and the Catholic minority did not. As part of the history of Northern Ireland, at a certain point, the Catholics had to give up their property, mostly their farms. It was kind of a punishment for supporting the wrong king in England. You know, the Catholics supported the Catholic king, and he was defeated by the Protestant king, and this was their punishment. And then at that time, the only people who owned property, this is the 1960s and 70s, only people who owned property could vote. And then, somewhat inspired by Martin Luther King's nonviolent protests, there was a march from Belfast to Derry, which is across Northern Ireland, to protest and to advocate for everyone being able to vote. And nowadays seems like a reasonable enough request. But as it started to gather momentum, it seemed to become more of a threat to the established authorities. And at one point they decided they would baton charge the marchers and disperse them. And then they would just come back together and march some more, as the journey they were doing was about 100 miles. And then at some point, they decided that they would shoot them. And so they did. And I think this is kind of like a worldwide consideration. You know, you use brute force to intimidate people into submission, and then it backfires. It turns them into, a more radical approach. And that's what happened in Northern Ireland. For centuries, there's been a kind of a protest against the English occupation, often violent, and that had more or less subdued until they shot these marchers, and then that sort of flared right up, and that was in '68. And I grew up in a working class part of Belfast, completely Catholic. The more working class areas were more ghettoized. The Catholic area was completely Catholic. The Protestant area, working class area, was completely Protestant. And the Catholic area, through various discriminations, was quite impoverished. So, and that was the circumstances in which I grew up. And then, because the area I grew up was so radical, when the troubles, as we call them, flared up, the area I was in was kind of like the epicenter of it. And like quite literally, a little bit mirroring what's happened in Portland, where at that time the riots, the rioters commanded a certain area, probably about 6 or 8 city blocks, and the police couldn't go into it. And then the whole issue sort of grew very quickly. You know? The Catholics, outraged by the shooting of non-violent marchers, became militant, very quickly armed themselves, and then started to take actions against the police, and then the army was brought over from England, and then it was against the police and the army. In the meantime, the Protestants also created their own militias, and then it's sort of uneasy truths between Catholics and Protestants flared up into the whole society of Northern Ireland becoming just filled with mutual hostility. And then after about 4 years, '72, I left. And I did not want to, I mean, the way it seemed to me, it was either you're with us, you become part of the militant protesters, or you're against us. And I thought, well, I choose neither side, so I'll leave. And I did. And then, as I said, you know, I traveled a lot. I ended up living in Japan and then Thailand, came to the United States, came to San Francisco Zen Center in about mid-'70s. And then pretty much I've been here ever since. I've had many roles here, including being the abbot. And so by that time, 99, you know, I'd been at San Francisco Zen Center a couple of decades. I had been ordained in 1980. So I'd been practicing for quite a while. And so Michael suggested this bearing witness retreat. And on his inspiration, and then also on his sort of orchestration, so we led a retreat in Northern Ireland, and Bearing Witness retreat. We had about 30 participants from the United States, and they come over with us. The first couple of days, we traveled around the different parts of Belfast that by that time, the areas that were originally mixed, where Catholics and Protestants lived together, had become segregated. And there was actually very little of the city that wasn't either Catholic or Protestant. The areas that were mixed were now very small. And the area next to the one where I grew up, I grew up on the Falls Road, and the one next to it was the Shankill Road. And then the Falls Road was militantly Catholic, and the Shankill Road was militantly Protestant. And so we did a silent bearing witness walk up the Falls Road. And as is still the case there, the gable endings on the houses, they paint murals. And they are, the subject matter of the mural is an expression of the militancy of that particular area. So we'd stop in the mural, we'd stand there silently bearing witness for a few moments, and then we'd walk another block, and there'd be another mural, and we'd stop there. And so we walked up the Falls Road, we walked across, and we walked down the Shankill Road doing this bearing witness. Which, after we did it, upon reflection, I thought, that was a foolhardy and dangerous thing to do. We went to the very center of the violence and the intensity and animation. So, however, one of the things we discovered was that when you walk in a meditative way and bear witness in silence, it has its own kind of intensity that even though people didn't particularly, I think, understand what we were about, it had some kind of presence that they kind of looked at us and then didn't say anything. And then what we did was we literally held a retreat. We rented a retreat center. And by the way, we put all this together in a matter of days, believe it or not, when we got there. We rented a retreat center, and we had a meditation retreat, a Zazen retreat. And then we brought some people who lived in Belfast, some Protestants, some Catholics, and we had a council. And the question we asked them to speak to was how they had suffered through the Troubles. And this took some negotiation, because when we first suggested it to them, the Catholics didn't want to be in the same room as the Protestants, and the Protestants didn't want to be in the same room as the Catholics. So it took quite a bit of negotiation, reassurance, persuasion. And so they did. And the process was very powerful. and very connected. You know, it's interesting when you talk about how you've suffered. Uh, there's a commonality. You know, they all had suffered through the violence. There was mutual animosity, and it was actually violent animosity. I remember one person saying his house had been bombed 4 times. Uh, Almost every one of them had relatives who were killed. So we finished that retreat and declared it a success. And the people who'd come with us from the States went home. And then something that was a great teacher for me was that someone in the States wrote, I think, in the newsletter of their local parish, but somehow it reached back to Northern Ireland. The people in Northern Ireland, they felt belittled by how they were being described. Like they were they were created the way that they thought the person had written it up. They were sort of exotic curiosities, you know, all these curious people, you know, who live in these terrible circumstances. One thing I would say, you know, and I think it's probably common of most violent torn areas, is that your life becomes almost schizophrenic, where every day you're acutely aware of what bombs happened, who was shot, who was killed, who was beaten up in the streets, what houses were firebombed. Every day, that was the news. And then at the same time, you wanted your kids to go to school. You wanted to go to your work and earn your livelihood. So there's kind of like a need for normalcy, for the normal activities of life to happen. And so in connecting to the people in Northern Ireland in response to that newsletter and seeing how they felt offended, I realized, you know, that there's a deeper sense of bearing witness. You know, Dogen Zenji, he called, you know, I mean, I think Bernie's 3 tenets, well, I think of them as Bernie's because he made them up. You know, the not knowing, the bearing witness, the action. You know, Dogen Zenji called it identity action. You know, that the action comes out of the place. You know, and what it created within me was a notion that we couldn't just come and do something. That we had to immerse, you know, in what was happening and let something arise out of it. And so then I started going back every spring and every fall. And you know, and quite quickly, I mean, even the first time we were there, we met some practitioners from there. We met a person called Frank Liddy. Actually, it was quite humorous. I asked someone I knew who was a Theravada monk in England. And I said, "Are there any Buddhists in Belfast?" And he said, "Yes, there's one called Frank Liddy." So I literally, he gave me his address. I went in and he knocked on his front door and said, "Are you Frank Liddy?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And all these years later, we're still very closely linked. And actually, it was Frank who helped orchestrate many of the things and still does. So then when I went back the next year, the year 2000, I don't quite know how it came to mind. The notion of meeting with all what you might call stakeholders. I don't know if that's a familiar term. It's certainly a familiar term in Northern Ireland. I hope, you know. So we met with all the stakeholders, from the militant Protestants to the militant Catholics. You know. Like there's an organization in Northern Ireland called the Orange Lodge. Interestingly, started the same year as the Ku Klux Klan. And their constitution, if you could call it that, is to be opposed to the papist Catholic religion. You know, that's I don't know what the constitution of the Ku Klux Klan is, but I think it's something similar. You know, that they're opposed to some sense of tolerance racially. So we met with them. We met with people who were active in the violence on the Catholic side and on the Protestant side. We met with politicians. We met with social workers. We met with clergy. And in doing so, a very interesting thing sort of came about, which was that when you create a reputation of meeting with everyone, you're regarded, even in a divided community, you're sort of like set aside in a different category. And then, you know, when I first started going back, there would be newspaper articles written about me, and they would always say something like, "Paul Haller from the Lower Falls Road," you know, where you're from identifies you in that society. And then they would say, "And now, you know, abbot of San Francisco Zen Center." You know. And then developing a reputation for meeting with everyone and trying to attend to the full range of sensibilities. To me, that was an expression of, you know, the first tenet, don't know. Even though I grew up there, I had left 20 years ago. How could I know what it was like? You know? And when I grew up there, I grew up in a Catholic neighborhood. You know? In our neighborhood, the bakery where we bought our bread was Catholic. The dairy where we bought our milk and our groceries, they were Catholic. The schools were Catholic. And similarly for the Protestant areas, theirs was a very defined and limited experience. So this, for me, even though I'd grown up there, this meeting the full range of people was very powerful. And then part of how it happened was that Frank Liddy, as a sort of genius for connecting, you know? I think a little bit like Bernie. I don't know if you know Bernie's teaching of the 5 houses of Buddha, you know? and the communicator. Frank, like Bernie, was the communicator and still is. You know? And then, so the strategy shifted, and then also, then I would start to do workshops with, sometimes do workshops with community workers, social workers, people who've been traumatized, you know. And this was creating it created a sort of an access and to be of service. And then at this time, you know, as the troubles in Northern Ireland developed, an extraordinary amount of attention worldwide was like one of the projects that was going on was out of Stanford University. And they had linked the process in South Africa to the process in Belfast, to the process in the Middle East, and to the process in Sri Lanka. Like when George Mitchell, a senator in the US, when he was helping to negotiate what became known as the Good Friday Agreement, the peace treaty, that he was using as a resource somewhat what had happened in South Africa. You know? And in fact, later in Northern Ireland, we also had a truce commission, as they had in South Africa. As they were starting to get the two sides to negotiate, you know, I don't know if you know this, but one of the first things you negotiate is the shape of the table you're going to sit at. And I've been told it took 6 months to decide on the shape of the table. But the wisdom of it is, what you've done is you've got both sides together, you've got them to talk to each other, and you've got them to agree to a common outcome. So you've achieved a whole lot. And so there were projects like that. There were other projects, other projects that just brought in support. And then we find, quite organically, not quite knowing what we were doing, I think through incompetence rather than some non-dual wisdom. And one of the things I had come across, and then it sort of became our standard bearer, was Naomi Shihab's ninth poem on kindness. I don't know if you know that poem. Do you know that poem? Oh, then I'll read it to you. And then years later, I became good friends with the author, and still am. And she came to Belfast. As we travel around doing these workshops, this was, you know, the notion was what we had to offer was not so much something new to learn, but something that could support unlearning. You know, how do you unlearn prejudice? How do you unlearn, you know, lifelong attitudes and things? So here's the poem we read. by Naomi. Before you can know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you know the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in the white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and a simple breath to keep him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing inside. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak it till it fills your voice, catches the thread of all sorrows until you see the size of its cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze, to buy bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, it is I you've been looking for. It then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. So we did this for many years. I had hoped that Michael Keith would be here because in the subsequent years after the first year, Michael came back and, Michael's in movies. He's a movie star. And he made a video. And so we made a short video of it, or Michael did. We would have arguments, Michael would be, many of the things we did were very intense, and people would go into a very vulnerable, emotional place. And I would always insist, turn the camera off. And he would always say, but this is the part that gives it the whole thing drama and depth. To me, it was always, are we immersing in this and becoming part of it? Or are we voyeurs, maybe to put it an edge to it, And so this notion of bearing witness, I've always had a kind of a mixed sensibility about it. Like to me, the notion of immersion, like I would think for years, when I would go there, even thinking about giving this talk, I could see what it brought up in me, And so when I would go there, maybe for, I don't know, at least 5 or 6 years, maybe a decade, there would be an intensity to it. Like I would wake up in the morning and I would be crying, and it wasn't like there was something in the foreground of my mind, that was saying, well, I'm upset because of this. It was something more visceral, more deep. That kind of immersion, One thing I've learned is that every context where we try to help, it has a depth, that we should treat with reverence, and the utter humility of not knowing. Like when I read of the peacemakers doing work with, First Nation people, I think, the hundreds of years of trauma, of mistreatment, of broken treaties, of being promised things and then taken away. How do we honor that depth? How do we treat it with the kind of cultural humility? So certainly that, and then coming from there, that subterranean process going on, and then discovering how do you practice the Dharma under those circumstances. And we did, we started a center, and we still have a center there. And initially I had thought these two would be utterly intertwined, but it turned out they weren't. It turned out that people came to the center to practice more or less how we do in the States. They were mostly more thoughtful, usually more educated, and that the other kind of work that we were doing, they weren't ready for it. Maybe they weren't so attracted. Some of them were, and a lot of them weren't. So we had kind of like parallel tracks, and in some ways still do. That we would have sessions, we'd have Dharma talks, we'd have sittings. We had that track, and then we had this other track where building a web of connection. And then there'd be certain people, each time I would go, I would visit them, connections would develop. And it was across the board. A lot of it facilitated by Frank Liddy. He lives there. I thought of having him come this evening, but it's 3 a.m. there. And then as we built that web of connection, then some more long-term thinking. And just through the network that we grew up, Frank also came from the same neighborhood I did, so we shared, that common oppression. Like while I left, Frank at one point was obliged to leave because there was a threat on his life. There was a threat to kill him. So he had to leave the country. He lived in Italy for a year. And then a good friend, Marcin Amelia, a politician with the Sinn Féin, the Catholic Party. And up until then, even though they came from the same neighborhood I did, and essentially, like in the family I grew up, there was a strange Irish mix between revolution and religion, and that's who we were. But even as a child, I was on the religion side. So I was wary of the Sinn Féin party because they were part of the act of violence at one point. But over time, I've come to deeply appreciate Marcin. Marcin goes to a different church every Sunday. So he has been to every variety of Protestant, Presbyterian, Anglican, Episcopalian, Roman Catholic, and this is his way of being of service. That he is a politician. On Christmas morning, he goes to the homeless shelter and serves breakfast. And it came to be that he rose up the political ranks and he became the Lord Mayor. And then he asked me to be the chaplain. And then, this was a very interesting turn of events. We did an event in the city hall. And this was a place where, as children, it would be utterly beyond our notions that we'd be able to even go inside. We were the kind of minority to be despised, as minorities are. They are, dirty, stupid, lazy, and criminal, as our president was making clear a couple of nights ago in the debate. So to be there and for our good friend to be the mayor, and then what we planned a day of mindfulness at the city hall, and 300 people came, and we by this point we had made links with the social services, the university, the mental health organizations, and we provided that. And then I wrote this. Then Marcin asked me to write the city prayer, the prayer for the city of Belfast. And here's the prayer I wrote. May unceasing love embrace all in our city. In peace and well-being, we may bridge our differences with understanding. May we call forth the nobility of spirit that can inspire and support us to live as one community, celebrating diversity. I remember once I was talking to my sister, and a relative of ours during the Troubles was shot dead while sitting on the couch in his own living room. And someone, actually a couple of men, kicked open the front door, walked into the living room and shot him. And I remember, maybe 15 years after that, we were having a casual conversation and she started to talk about it. And in the following 10 or 15 minutes, she became completely re-traumatized by it. And I watched something in myself as I was thinking about this talk and recalling these images and memories. And I wouldn't say I was traumatized, but I could see something was, I give Dharma talks quite frequently. And, they create some internal process. But this is different. And I would offer you that as a thought that like I have done prison work. And after a long time, I realized that the prisoners, in were being very kind, that they were sparing us, those of us who came in to teach meditation, they were sparing us the brutalities and harshness of being a prisoner. I've heard some of the stories of the things that can happen there. It's this notion of not knowing, approaching with humility, and immersion. And then I think of the action as a kind of koan, And for me, I think of don't harm, whatever you do, don't cause harm. And then whatever you do, that's why that poem, kindness. And then I became good friends with the author. And actually, we teach together each year. And then I invited her to come. And about 5 years ago, she came. And one of the things that really touched her was in the area that I grew up in, the Falls Road, there's a lot of kinship with the people of Palestine because of how they are, an oppressed community. And so in solidarity with that, the people in the Falls Road fly the Palestinian flag. So when she was, seeing, we would drive through this area and she'd see all these Palestinian flags. And then when I told her, she couldn't believe it. And it was literally an expression of solidarity. And then she's come back since, and so the peace treaty was signed in 98. We went there in 99. And it's interesting, you might think, well, everything's fine now. But it's a little bit like saying, well, the Civil War happened long ago, and of course there's no racism in the South or the North anymore. It's like there's still there's still that there's not much open violence at all, but there's still deep-seated prejudices. Like I remember talking to Roshi when he was mayor, and we were saying, people need jobs, when people are impoverished, disenfranchised, they search for something, some way of expressing their rage. And, so healing, to my mind, seems like a slow process. And then in some ways, the resources, the amount of attention and the money poured into healing a community in Northern Ireland is much more than seems to be in the States. Like there's very little homeless in Northern Ireland. Like there's just the social system is robust enough to ensure that there aren't many people on the street. So, any questions? Any comments?
Paul, we're right at the top of the hour, so I want to make sure that we're mindful of your commitment. If you have a few more minutes.
I do.
Okay.
I want to be respectful of other people's time too, but I have a few more minutes.
Okay. Well, please, anyone, if you've got a question, go ahead, and I can see everyone. We're all on one screen here. So if you want to wave your hand and unmute yourself, and Wayne, Sato, hi.
Hi, thank you, Paul. I'm from England. I'll put that out there straight away, and I hope you'll accept the question nevertheless. Did you struggle with your own bias at all, growing up Catholic there and then going in as a neutral kind of party? Did a lot come up for you?
Well, as I was saying, Wayne, and by the way, ironically enough, the only strong friend I have from that era of my life is English and went to public school.
Okay. I hear you.
So it's strange, the journeys our lives take. It's but when I think of myself, of reconnecting to some deep uneasiness about it all, and then that was there, and then I became quite disenchanted with the Catholicism that I learned as a child, before I left Northern Ireland. So it wasn't like I had a strong Catholic identity in leaving. Interestingly enough, in the last 15, 20 years, I've had an enduring relationship, with a mentor who is a Benedictine monk. And that's really my, I think, rapprochement with Catholicism. So when I went there, I was very much a Buddhist, a Zen Buddhist, or maybe a Buddhist in general. Certainly didn't matter much there. And as I say, watching someone like Marcin, who I think would consider himself a Catholic, but watching how it manifests through social action, I have a lot of appreciation and admiration for that. And in Northern Ireland, as you probably know, Catholic and Protestant are more like ethnicities than just religious beliefs. I mean, it was a wonderful irony, because the religious leaders would come together, make a joint statement of saying, we should be one people. We should unite. And then, of course, these very people who were fighting in the name of Catholicism and Protestantism ignored the leaders and continued doing what they're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Sato. Thanks, Paul. We have a little. Well, we'll see how much time we have. Maybe is there another question from anyone? Please. and nature loves a vacuum. So if you don't have one, I have 5. And I promise not to ask them all, but
It looks
Martin,
like Martin does.
thank you, Martin.
So Paul, it's first very nice to see you again. I saw you in '99 in San Francisco. I came there for a session in August, September in Tashihara, and I haven't seen you since. So it's wonderful to see you again.
Nice to see you again, Martin.
And as a former seminarian Catholic, now peacemaker, I'm very touched by your story today, because for me it's one is the sort of the language of immersion and the language of humility. It speaks very much to the heart of the 3-tenet practice for me. It speaks to the heart of that, and it's just a lovely little tinge of language that speaks deeper to what we are endeavouring to do with our peacemaker practice. But for me, the bridge between my Catholicism and Zen practice and the Diamond Sangha lineage and the peacemaker practice has been a journey. So this is more of a comment to say that I'm touched and enriched by your sharing of story today. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Another question from anyone here? Feel free. I will go ahead and play my moderator's card here. Paul, I'm reminded of, I was pleased you got to speaking about truth and reconciliation, because I'm not aware of the history more recently, and that had occurred in Northern Ireland as it had in South Africa. Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative talks about the need for that here in the States. And I think a lot of people have been surprised the last few years how much healing or change of people's hearts has not occurred in the United States. I think a lot of people are taken aback by the, just the virulence of racism and how tenacious it is. So I do have a question here, and I'm wondering, given time passing, given work having been done in Northern Ireland, given truth and reconciliation efforts, are people's hearts changing? Do you see that? Do you feel that? What's that? What is that? Is it palpable? Is it visible?
Jeff, I've witnessed an arc of it. It seemed like when the peace treaty was signed, the Good Friday Agreement, there was a sense of relief. But the lived experience of the past 30 years was like in people's bones, the wariness. Like I find even in myself now, after all these years, that, my friend Roshi, we were sitting, when I was growing up, we were all white, I mean, one of the terrible things about racism is you can easily identify the difference. So when I was growing up, we were all white. My name, Paul, isn't particularly Catholic. I mean, it is and it isn't. And so I was always wary of disclosing, and so those habits were instilled into the society. You know, you didn't know, what if you were with the wrong kind of people? What would be the consequences? Like one interesting anecdote I had, once I wanted to meet with this militant Protestant leader, you know, and we were discussing where we could meet, you know. And I was saying, I suggested a place, and he said, well, I couldn't go there. That would be too dangerous for me. And I said, well, what if I go there? And he says, no, that would be too dangerous for you, you know. And we had this discussion, you know, and this was soon after the Good Friday Agreement. And I would say that has loosened up to a large extent, and there's still pockets, there's still Protestant neighborhoods that I feel a little tense walking through, you know, and they're impoverished working class neighborhoods. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, like when I think of white supremacists, I think of something similar, you know. These are the disenfranchised people who somehow this is a way for them to assert some validity to their identity. So there is pockets. There's a whole new generation that don't know and don't care. You know, it's like, we're not that interested. That's your stuff. You fools from before. And then there's these pockets of the Orange Lodge, which is, you know, constructed around hatefulness. It marches through the city every 12th of July. A whole section of the population takes a vacation then. Mm-hmm. They make sure they're not around. Mm-hmm. The Catholics still riot then, you know, but it has shrunk in its pervasiveness and its intensity. So it's a mix. Mm-hmm. Like when you think of the riots we've had, you know, in the last 6 months in the United States, and actually we've had for the last 40 years, you know, mm-hmm. The Watts riots, you know, mm-hmm. Ferguson, you know, and the way it's been a kind of normalized, you know, that way that we want to carry on our usual lives, so we sort of accommodate these atrocities. Mm. And then when they're brought to the surface, I mean, I think when I think of United States, I think, oh, something's coming to the surface, and it's disruptive, and it presents difficult social choices, you know. What do you say to the person that says, you know, violent protest is necessary? You know, when I was, you know, as those things started in Northern Ireland, you know, I would discuss with my friends, you know, like, is violence a necessary agent of change? And I think, you know, I mean, personally, I would say no. But I've borne witness to others who said otherwise, you know. And I have similar kind of thoughts when I see, you know, in particular, young Black men, you know, violently protesting, destroying property. And I think, I don't know about you, but I don't find myself having an easy answer to that.
Mm.
Do you?
I don't. No.
Yeah.
I don't.
To me, it returns back to the first tenet, don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, we're all in learning mode. Okay.
Anyone else have a question? Comment? Phil, thank you. Hi.
Hi. Thanks, Paul, for your talk. I'm
You're
glad
welcome.
to have been here for this. I just had a quick question about, it's a little more just political, but I really don't know much about the dynamics enough to know how feasible or possible this is, but what your thoughts are on a potential reunification of Ireland, especially with Brexit. There's been some discussion around how that would work with the Republic staying in the EU. And I just wonder if you think that that's even realistic, given the sort of religious and cultural, and as you were saying, almost ethnic divides that still persist. And would that even be a step towards healing or unity, or not really, to have the island become one nation?
But there's a recent big question mark, with Brexit. What's Brexit going to look like? But before Brexit, part of the irony was that there's been this, the troubles and all that happened before it, in the South, and yet, as everyone was part of Europe, the border between the North and the South sort of disappeared. Like you could get a traffic ticket in the South, drive back to the North where you lived, and the local police would collect the traffic ticket on behalf of the people in the South. So there's the mutuality of everyday life had dissolved the border, and I think that seems to makes so much sense to the society that I don't think it's going to go away. I think the country might become functionally united, and then in a true Irish way, it'll be functionally united and then nominally divided. Like when it became the threat of the Britain dropping out of the European Common Market, a good half of the people who lived in Northern Ireland applied for Southern Irish passports because they wanted to be part of the European Common Market. So there's a practicality that's going on. At the same time, the questions of nationality are going on too. That's my own notion, but that's my observation too. Well, thank you all, and I hope something in all of that is useful to you, and hopefully we can all together take these lessons to heart and do what we can to help what's happening here.